Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishing professional development books and resources to support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Have you checked out their latest releases? Use the code JCTTR2324 for 20% off your order. Don't miss out. Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading.
Welcome to the Sunday Social with me, Miss H Teachers, aka Anna Hudson. I am absolutely delighted to be here today. Happy New Year, everyone. This is my first show back for 2024. And as I said, I am absolutely delighted to be here with you today. Firstly, as always, I just want to check in. How are you all? How has your work week been? I hope that you've had some time to yourself over the weekend and that you're in a good place. I hope that last week was a positive one for you. I hope that you're looking forward to the week ahead. Please, as always, take care of yourselves. Reach out if you need any support. You know that everybody here is here to support you. And hopefully today we can offer a little bit of an interesting chat, a little bit of CPD for you all. So, however you're listening today, whether it's live with me now or if you've downloaded it at a later date, thank you for choosing to support Teachers Talk Radio. I really hope that you get something out of today's show. Now, as always, our show would not be possible without the fantastic partnership of John Catt Educational. And this show is brought to you in partnership with them. John Catt Educational publish professional development books and resources to support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Have you checked out their latest releases? Use code JCTTR2324 for 20% off your order. Don't miss out. Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading. So, as I said before, I am delighted to be hosting today, and I'm even more delighted to be joined by some very special guests as we explore the focus of today's show, neurodiversity. How do we best support students and staff? Now, this is a topic close to my heart. I am passionate about awareness and inclusivity, but are we doing enough to support neurodiverse learners and staff? I'm hoping today we can explore that topic. And as I mentioned, I've got some very, very special guests who will be joining me later. But what do we do as educators? How do we support our colleagues? How do we support our students? Does the mainstream curriculum in both primary and secondary allow neurodiverse learners to fully access learning opportunities? As the workload of teachers ever increases, are we making enough reasonable adjustments for our neurodiverse colleagues? Currently, according to the National Autistic Society, the government estimate that 1 in 100 people are autistic. However, many other surveys suggest that this rate is much higher. More men and boys are currently diagnosed than women and girls, at a ratio of approximately 3 to 1. Now, there's numerous factors that can contribute to this. Autistic characteristics may differ in genders. There may be fewer social difficulties in women and girls than in men and boys. Girls and women have a tendency to mask, and often there's misdiagnosis. But before we dive into that, what do I mean when I talk about neurodiversity? Now, for many colleagues who are listening today, we've had lots and lots of training on this, but do we really delve into the specifics? When I'm talking about neurodiversity, I'm talking about aspects such as ADHD, ASC, PDA, ODD, dyscalculia, dyslexia, dysgraphia, Asperger's. Now, 2 of those that I've just mentioned, PDA and ODD, are only starting to be recognised more recently. PDA, pathological demand avoidance, and ODD, oppositional defiance disorder. Lots and lots of terminology fall under neurodiversity, but are we getting enough training as staff on the specifics related to each one? Do we feel that there's enough training for trainees and ECTs? The Department of Education shows that there are over 166,000 autistic pupils in schools in the UK, an 8% increase since 2020. And 70% of those pupils are educated in mainstream settings. Again, colleagues, is enough being done to support those learners? As teachers, are we given enough time to explore the topic, to have trial and error to see what works best for individual students and different cohorts? In 2021, the National Autistic Society issued a school report saying that a quarter of parents and carers waited over 3 years to receive support for their child. I've got to say myself that I can attest to that. Where I have the unique opportunity, obviously, to work, as many of you know, in alternative provision. I see firsthand the weight that parents and educators have to put up with to get the right support for children who not only need a diagnosis, but also need that educational healthcare plan to put in place the best support. 7 in 10 pupils from this National Autistic Society report said that school would be better if teachers fully understood autism. But colleagues, how can we best understand that if we don't get the opportunity to have the correct CPD, to have the time to fully learn about our students' needs? Dr. Tony Lloyd of the ADHD Foundation stated that ADHD remains statistically undiagnosed and undertreated in the UK. We know that waiting lists for pathways are incredibly long across the country. For many educators, we share the frustrations of our parents and carers who know that their children need this additional support but cannot get it because the NHS is currently so overwhelmed. So what is the impact on education, and how do we best support within the classroom? Well, it's estimated that each classroom in the UK has at least one neurodiverse pupil, although many of us will agree that in reality, with those waiting lists that I mentioned, it's likely to be much higher. Now, I would say that all of us in schools do our best to support neurodiverse learners as much as we can. There have been some great progress. For example, SENCO support, IEPs, EHCPs, they all play their part. And I would say from my experience of working with mainstream schools, that process is positive. You know, I think that there are lots and lots of schools that are working in great partnerships, not just SENCOs and staffs, but also reaching out to other agencies, to other charities to get that support. But as I mentioned, we know that the pathways and the EHCP waiting lists are so high. So how do we practically support pupils in the here and now? I've got a really high ratio of neurodiverse pupils in my class. And as I mentioned before, I know that working in alternative provision, I have the luxury of a smaller classroom environment. And with that comes the opportunity for observations, for opportunity for trial and error, to really get to know those pupils on a much deeper level and be able to try and test those strategies in a supportive way. But I recognise that for mainstream colleagues who have 30 plus children a class, who teach multiple classrooms in large mainstream schools, it's very, very challenging. So, what do we need? Well, I would argue that smaller class sizes is going to be something that we always argue we need, whatever a student presents with. We also need a higher ratio of staff. I could sit here and talk about the teacher retention crisis, the current struggles schools are having to employ TAs, but I think we're all aware of that. But we know that as an education community, we do need smaller classrooms. We do need higher ratios of staff. We do also need that specific CPD on all those different areas that are encompassed within the neurodivergent community, because it's having that specific information that makes all the difference. Now, as I said, I've got a range of pupils within the cohorts that I teach, and I often spend a lot of time looking and tracking those signs, those behaviours, those triggers. Mainstream colleagues, I would urge you to do the same if and when you can. I, like everybody else, am aware of teacher workload, and it is really difficult when you've got multiple classes. But understanding those triggers, understanding those nuanced signs that maybe differ particularly between boys and girls, is vital. It's vital not only in understanding the strategies that work for students, but also in gathering that evidence to make a strong EHCP application. But is there enough training on neurodiversity? Would you feel confident in tracking those behaviours, in tracking those triggers, in looking for those signs? I would love to hear from you today. So if you're able to, please, DM me or request to speak. I would love to hear from you. Particularly if you're an ECT or trainee, do you think your course gives you enough opportunity to explore SEND in general? Are there enough opportunities for you to work with neurodiverse specialists to get that solid foundational knowledge, to understand what you're looking for and how to best support different learners? In mainstreams and in alternative provisions, is enough time given to classroom setup? Is there enough consideration of how to create an inclusive classroom, on how to gather that effective supporting evidence? And what about within the curriculum itself? I think all of us listening will understand and acknowledge the overcrowding and demand-heavy curriculum, both in primary and secondary. How flexible can mainstreams really be? Is it possible to adhere to every learner's needs, individual needs? Or do we just need to look at best practice? There have been huge changes in the classroom that even I acknowledge in the last 10 years. And there is lots of good practice taking place and lots of opportunities to support neurodiverse needs. I think the increase of brain breaks has been huge, and strategies across the board, such as visual timetables and social stories, sensory calming displays, fidget and sensory toys, have all played a huge part. I know that in lots of mainstream schools, having that structured routine, the additional employment of one-to-ones, specific timers, individual working environments and learning desks have worked really well. Many schools work closely with parents and carers, and this is also a really important key aspect, making sure that you're working in a holistic way in supporting those young people. For me, I would say that that's the key element. I think we've made lots and lots of progress, but one of the most important ones for me is that parental engagement, having those meetings, talking about what works at home, what parents and carers have found works in terms of strategies, having that united approach to be able to trial things at school and continue them at home so that there's that consistency. That said, it's not always easy when you're in a mainstream school. As I mentioned, statistics show there's at least one neurodiverse pupil in each class, but let's be honest, we know there's a lot more. And with that, having continuous parental meetings, having to trial different opportunities and different strategies can increase workload. And then that brings into play neurodiverse staff. If demand of workload is too much, what impact does that have on our neurodiverse colleagues? What strategies are we putting in place to support them? Other tips that I've found that work really well for both staff and students is all around preparation. I conference quite a lot with some of our neurodiverse staff in my own provision when I mentioned about creating this show, and also with some of our older learners. And I asked them what worked best for them. The big one that came up across the board was demand avoidant practice. Now, I think that can be done in a really beneficial way across the board, whether you're in mainstream or whether you're in alternative or specialist provision, because it's not about overwhelming with choice. It's just about giving options. It's about using perhaps modified language. For example, could you instead of do that? Or I'm going to, would you be able to help? Just removing that demand, because with those demands comes anxiety. And then that anxiety can manifest in different ways. Some colleagues said to me that it makes them feel, the anxiety makes them go very quiet, almost too quiet, to the point where some people misinterpret that as being negative, that they're being ignorant or rude, which is absolutely not the case. It's that demand that's been put on them immediately causes such a high level of anxiety. A coping strategy is to go quiet and to go quite insular. For some of our students, they said that when they feel demands are put too much on them, their way to communicate that is through frustration and behaviour. So sometimes implementing that demand avoidant practice within the classroom can be really useful. Another strategy that I think has worked well, again, for both colleagues and for students, is about that almost that preemptive learning. So offering opportunities to know what's coming. Now, obviously, you can argue that comes through a visual timetable, but for older learners, one of the things that I found works really well is to talk to them beforehand about what the next lesson will be. And that might be at the end of the lesson itself, or it might be a different opportunity before the next lesson. So, for example, if I teach that pupil on a Tuesday for PSHE, for example, then on the following Monday, I'll speak to that pupil first and just give them a little heads up on what's coming. And that's been a really useful strategy that has had really positive feedback from students and from staff. Also giving opportunity for time after a transition. I understand for mainstream staff, it's really difficult when you have to cram in so much of a curriculum and you've got 30 plus students waiting to start a lesson, and a pupil might need a couple of minutes regulation time after they've transitioned into the classroom. It is difficult, and I'm mindful that not all of these strategies will work for everyone. But if there is opportunities for that student to have a couple of minutes to just regulate before the lesson starts, whether that's in or out of the classroom, the feedback I've had is that that's really important and can often lead then to a really positive learning experience for the rest of the lesson. As I've mentioned before today, obviously I've got some incredible guests coming on, and I could sit here and I could tell you all the different strategies that I use and my opinions on neurodiversity, and I hope to share that with you across the show. But I think it would be remiss of me to not introduce the two guests that I have today, both of whom have got an absolute wealth of experience of neurodiversity and of neurodiverse children and adults. I've got Sally Gordon with me today, who's a teaching assistant with over 10 years of experience, and Jo Galbraith, who runs a charitable organisation supporting neurodiverse children and their families. And I think for me, their impact and their feedback is going to be incredible to this show, because we're hearing from people who've got that experience. So the first person I'd like to introduce today is the incredible Sally Gordon. Sally, hopefully you are there and can join in the conversation today. How are you, Sally?
I'm fine, thank you. Can you hear
Yes,
me?
we can. That's absolutely brilliant.
Good.
Thank you. Sally, thank you so much for joining me today. As I said, I mean, I could whitter on today about my views on neurodiverse learners and neurodiversity as a collective, and how we best support young people and families and colleagues. But actually, I think we need to hear from people who've got more of that first-hand experience. So I just wondered if you could tell our listeners a little bit about your background in education.
Yeah, I didn't go into education until my son got type 1 diabetes like 10 years ago, and he was it came to a light that he was autistic as well. So I've always wanted to do it, but didn't think I was clever enough to go into schools. And then obviously retrained, and then I got my first job in a severe complex needs school. And from there, it's just taken off for me, really.
That's absolutely amazing. So obviously within your school experience, you'll probably have had lots of interaction and offered lots of support to neurodiverse pupils and families. I suppose my first question is, what do you think? How do you think we can best support? If we start with pupils first, what best support do you think we can offer to pupils? How do we best support our neurodiverse learners, our neurodiverse students? What do you think is the best support we can offer?
It's hard for me to say that because I've only ever worked in, as I say, severe complex needs school and then alternative provision. And they do an absolutely amazing job purely because, and again, it's due to funding, class sizes, everything like that. We've got all these set up there to do it. My experience of mainstream schools for myself, because I'm like 43, so obviously I would say I'm an 80s baby growing up. And then with my own children is, I think it's potluck, what school you get, what funding there is, things like that. So I think mainstream do the best they can with what they got.
Yeah.
And I think it's really difficult for mainstreams at the moment.
I'd massively agree with that. I think there's so many challenges, isn't there, around, you know, as I said, I work in alternative provision. I have the luxury of being with my learners, with the pupils, on a really small, intimate level, where you are watching behaviours and signs of triggers, and you're seeing behaviours that are in patterns, and so you can observe all that, you can note it, you can then trial different strategies and see what works and what doesn't. And also, we've got a really high level of neurodiverse learners within the provision. So I think with anything, you become really attuned to looking out for triggers and signs and patterns of behaviour really quickly. Whereas if you haven't got that experience, it can be quite daunting. And and for Senkos, there's only one of them in huge schools, and there's not always a team. So being able to come and observe a pupil and look at different strategies and work closely with the parents and with the pupils can be really difficult, because there's so many pupils that need your time and support. I think one of the things that I found interesting recently, obviously when I was doing the research from this, but also from my own experience, is the rise in girls and women being diagnosed. What have you got any experience of that yourself?
Yeah, so obviously when I was growing up, I was more introvert. So I was always the one that sat at the back of the class, didn't really pay attention. Because nothing sank in for me, I thought I was stupid. So obviously all through my life, thought I was stupid and I wasn't good enough at education. So I didn't really go down that route. And then obviously I I got some GCSEs, came out of school, and then I ended up working. And then it wasn't until I was obviously a lot later on in life that I thought, actually, I can give this a go and surprise myself. Girls are amazing at masking. Now, because of this at the moment, a lot, and I have to choose my words correctly here because I'm not being nasty to some people. A lot of professionals will not recognise girls because they're not jumping off the walls, they're not fidgeting. We're very introvert, so all our hyperactivity is internal. And it was only since I got my diagnosis myself, and it was a relief actually, because to tell you the truth, I had to fight for it, and I knew I had it, and I had to fight to get it. I had 10 years of mental health, and the doctors, unfortunately, some, again, I have to choose my words carefully over this, some, not all, some professionals will be like, especially with women, and this is true because I've read up about it and researched it, they'll go down the route of it's anxiety first, it's depression, it's this, it's that. And I understand they have to do that route first because obviously they can't just slap a label on someone and say that's it. But for me, when I went to the doctor, one of the doctors said at 43, do you just want a label? And it wasn't anything to do with just having a label. I just wanted to understand myself. So it's about understanding. And once you understand yourself and you know your triggers, you can put so much in place. So at the moment, I am suffering like everybody else trying to get hold of my tablets because they did come back in and then they've gone. So I'm struggling to get hold of my tablets as well. And sometimes I have to wait, a good few weeks before they come back into stock. So I have to know my triggers and I know when to ease off with things myself. So if I didn't have that understanding of myself, I'd be horrific. I'd be awful.
I think that's really interesting because obviously quite a lot of what you've said there applies to colleagues, well, to staff and colleagues, and also pupils and students, in the sense of, I'm presuming for your tablets, you're talking about ADHD, aren't you? And is that the
Yeah,
medication that you take to support
yeah,
you with those triggers and symptoms of your
yeah,
ADHD? I know that's common across the board, and that's one of the things when I decided to do the show and people reached out, said that's one of the frustrating things as well, is that for teachers and school educational staff, they can see for their pupils who have got a diagnosis, who have got that medication, who want that medication and need it, that they're seeing an increase in challenging behaviours because of this, because of this depletion, because of this kind of reduced stock of, and this kind of across the board
it is. But
unavailability of
yeah, of course it is. But there's so much we can do to support pupils, and like I get so much support in the alternative provision that I work in. So if I've unfortunately not had my tablets, I will go and tell my manager, and I'll tell the teacher that I work with, and I'm really honest and open with the pupils as well,
Mm.
just so they know that I understand them and we can work together to help each other.
I do think that's one of the things, isn't it, that's really important to do with any neurodiverse learner, is to create that open culture where we talk about neurodiversity with positivity, but with that inclusivity, that this is, it's not, so it's not a stigma, it's not something to be scared of, it's not something that's negative, it's this is the way I learn, this is what the way I function, this is the way my brain
It's
works.
funny you
And
should say
actually
that
this is
because
what
it's so funny because since I got diagnosed, and I'm really honest and open with people now about it, and
yeah.
that's not because I want any excuses about myself, because I do not make excuses for myself.
Mhm.
I have to learn how to behave. I have to, like before I was so tempted to interrupt, but I thought no, I've got to let that person finish speaking beforehand. So it's little things like this that we can learn. So for me, since I've become honest and open, I started a little workshop with a small group of when I say girls, young ladies, teenagers about it, and they was like, it's so nice because now we understand why we do these things. And then since I've been really open about it, I've actually had adults from professions coming up to me asking me how I got diagnosed. So
Wow.
I think as soon as you open up to people, it's amazing how many people you've got coming to you. I've even had friends saying they think their partners are. How do they, it just opens the door to a lot more things.
And self-understanding, isn't it? I think diagnosis for adults and for children is really important. I think, I mentioned before, there's huge waiting lists for pathway and for educational healthcare plans, and that's incredibly frustrating because diagnosis is key. And also, like you said, it then opens up that line of communication and opens up that line of self-discovery for parents and carers to look at what that means for their child and how best to support their child, and what strategies they can trial, and what will work and what won't, and what supports out there. And I think for colleagues and for educational staff, about understanding themselves, and then for reasonable adjustments to be made, because one of the things that I think, and I hope that all schools, and I think that, I'm really passionate about alternative provision, but I'm really supportive of mainstream schools as well. I do think schools are doing their best to put in place reasonable adjustments for pupils. However, do we do that for educational staff? Are we ensuring that our staff have that opportunity as well? Because I thought to myself, well, if I'm sat here saying, and which I have done today, here's, I sometimes preemptively offer learning opportunities for our pupils. So I'll go to them and say, this is what you're going to be learning, so that they've got time to process it and they know what they're coming into. Do we do that for staff? And some of the staff that I spoke to, and some of the colleagues I spoke to who I've got neurodiverse needs. And I'm talking about different provisions here because I've got friends across the country that have a diagnosis, said sometimes they're not given the opportunity to process. So deadlines, are deadlines given with time to complete and additional time if they need to process it first? Is information given and then is the opportunity to process given? Or is it just, I'm on the cuff, I'm going to grab that person because I need to pass this on and this on, etc.? Is support given if they're struggling with anxiety? Unseen tasks, deadline. Schools, I understand schools are busy and complex and the working day is challenging, but do you think we give enough time to neurodiverse colleagues? Do you think we give them enough support and reasonable adjustment, Sally?
It's really hard to say because where I work, I mean, I love it, and because I'm even right down from sort of like management right the way down to the bottom, we support each other so much. And I remember we've just had the Christmas fair, and I remember I won't say the name, but the maths teacher walked past me and he went, "You all right? You don't like change, do you?" Because I was standing away from the Christmas fair, and I went, "No." So because we're such a close knit group, we all know each other so well. So I think having that tight knit group helps so much. Now, if I didn't have that support, even right down from just a teacher passing me in the corridor, would I still be there? I don't know. Do you know what I mean? So I think it comes from the top and it goes all the way right down to the bottom. So it's not just, do we put enough in place, as in, are we supporting those people? I think it's everything. It's right down to that teacher walking past you. Like, that teacher noticed that I wasn't coping well with the Christmas fair and I just stood away. Do you know what I mean? So I think it's everything. It's a whole bag, and it's so difficult to squeeze everything in to such a short time space, because you're teaching all day, and then after that you've got other duties to do when the kids go home. It's not just as simple as what some people might think. The kids go home and then that's it. You have a whole other job to do after those children go home. And then it's squeezing it into the day, and then we have to give the children what they need because they are children, but then do we put ourselves on the back burner like like everyone does at home as well? So it's really difficult to say. I couldn't say yeah and I couldn't say no, because obviously, sorry, I was going to say there's always more you can do, isn't there? There's always more we can put in place.
Yeah, and I think as leadership, I'm sat here and I'm listening. I'm thinking, well, is there not necessarily a team, but is there, as a collective, do we do enough? Because I'm sitting here thinking, okay, from a pupil point of view, are there regular check-ins with those pupils who have neurodiverse needs? Are we trialing things effectively? Are we recording and evidencing things for EHCPs and for Pathway? Are we building those bonds and creating that open culture for all students, so that all students understand neurodiverse needs? And then at the same time, I'm sitting here and thinking, okay, well, how does that look from a staff point of view? And I'm thinking, is there a designated person within school? Is it, for example, the Senko, that neurodiverse staff can go and see if they perhaps work in a large mat or, in a large mainstream, so that they've got a check-in person who checks in with them to check things are okay? Is there, like there would be for a pupil, a plan in place for sharing information ahead of time so that there's time to process things? Is additional time giving for things like workload, for planning, etc., so that processing and work time is in unison with what that staff member needs? And I'd be interested to hear from mainstream colleagues, but I know my own experience from mainstream, I'd have to say probably not. I think it would be up to the individual school to put that in place, and there may be some schools that are doing that brilliantly, but actually, is it not something we need across the board, where it should be in every school, and it's good practice to have it in every school? And I think maybe that's something I'd like to do a little bit more research into and think about. I mean, I'd be really interested in hearing from mainstream colleagues. If you have you had that experience? Is there support there for neurodiverse colleagues, or is it an ad hoc kind of, oh, we'll deal with that if a staff member identifies as neurodiverse. I'd be really
Do you know what?
interested to hear.
Do you know what, though, Anna? Isn't it like that sort of with anything, like any company, shall we say, anyone that works with, no one really addresses the issue until something happens, do they? And
No,
then it could have gone too far down the line, and then you're trying to recuperate further stuff. Do you know what I mean? So, and then I think as well, I mean, I know it's changing tactic a little bit as well, but I think even in this country, even though it's all over the advertisements, talk therapy and everything like that, and your mental health and everything like that, I still, and I know ADHD and neurodiverse isn't mental health as such, but I still think people, one, don't understand it fully unless you're in it, and two, I still think it's a bit of a taboo subject. I really do. I think people are scared to say something.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishing professional development books and resources to support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Have you checked out their latest releases? Use the code JCTTR2324 for 20% off your order. Don't miss out. Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading.
I'd agree with that, and I think there's it's difficult, isn't it? Because what you want is you really want people to feel included and feel open and create that open dialogue. But if there is still a stigma there, and there is still worry about it being recognised and about how people might respond to it, then there's that barrier there, isn't there? And that's that's really challenging. I mean, Paul sent a tweet in, and I think it sums it up beautifully. And he says, "I imagine the level of understanding is the first important step. In mainstream, there are still many professionals who are sceptical of ADHD and neurodiverse needs. If this is the case, it's much harder to be given that support." And it kind of sums that up, really, isn't it? It's because not everyone has got experience of neurodiverse needs and knows.
Do you know
how
what
to
though? And a lot of people as well, which when I was speaking to the I always say young ladies to give them, do you know what I mean? Because they are teenagers, so they're not kids, are they? The girls that I was speaking to in my school, I was like, do you realise our brains are actually made differently? It's and I was going through all the science bits of it all, and they didn't know that. And I think just starting at the bottom and waking up, they were like, oh, right, so we're like that because this is, and I was like, yes. I was like, this isn't just something that's just, we were made, our brains are actually made differently. And I think just starting there is a massive point. And, like my son, he's a mainstream, he's autistic, and he's coped absolutely amazingly. But I do still think there are teachers out there that don't fully understand it. But then at the same time, half me goes, why should they fully understand it if they haven't got it? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that, and that, I take on board that point. I think for me as a teacher, I think it's really hard because we want to be experts in everything, and we can't. Workload, subject knowledge, it's impossible for us to be experts on everything. But I feel that in SEND and alternative provision, you do get a lot more CPD and opportunities to experience neurodiverse needs and SEND needs than you do in mainstream. And I've talked about this in other shows, that I think moving forward with education, I do think there needs to be more opportunities for mainstream staff and alternative provisions and specialist provisions to work more collaboratively, because there's a wealth of knowledge and experience out there, because no two children present the same, but there are often similar characteristics, and if you can spot them early enough, you can put strategies in. But if you've not had no experience of that, with the teacher workload, you don't always have time to go away and
no, definitely. And do you know what I really do? And I'm really when I say patient, I mean I always like to. That's the wrong word to use. I work very closely with my kids' schools, so because I like to have that parent contract, so they know what's going on at home and I know what's going on in school, and to build a good bond between them. I can't remember what I was going to say now.
Is it about, we were saying about not always having that experience and that CPD?
Oh,
and
that's what I was going to say. Sorry. Say I've had no tablets. I forget what I'm going to say. That's what I was going to say. I feel, and I always say this, that I couldn't work in mainstream because I'd get frustrated, being totally honest. Not frustrated with the children, just frustrated. And again, it's going that above and beyond, as in government, because again, it's the same and the same for all of us. They slap something on like education wise and say every child should have to learn and do this, which is fair enough. But you've got kids that might not be able to do that. And then that's where the kids start to feel that they like me, that they're stupid and they can't do it. And then it's like what you said before, you haven't got the funding and the teachers and the TAs in there to support the children to help them learn in a different way. So,
Yeah.
you know, it's a massive thing from the top and it goes all the way right down to the bottom. And you know, luckily enough for my two kids, I'm always like, no, you're not stupid. You just learn things in a different way, right? We have to learn to do things in a different way. So I always think that they've not had it lucky with me. God love them, but I'm that parent that understands. So I'll just go, okay, we'll just do things in a different way. That a parent of a child with the ADHD or autism or dyslexia even, they might not understand. So they might be like, God, my kid's like, why are they playing up? Why are they doing this? And then chastising the child for something that actually can't be helped. So it's it's just a horrible vicious circle, I think, at the moment that well, for as long as I know, that we're in.
I agree. I think it is really frustrating that we've just got this overcrowded curriculum where we can't, and we're not, we have like an inflexibility within the curriculum that we didn't used to have, where we can't diversify things as much as we want to, and we can't personalize things as much as we want to, and workload and Ofsted and all the other things kind of mount up. And then you've got, from a CPD point of view, like we said, you haven't got time to go away and do your own research, but you might only be getting basic CPD. And I do think some areas of neurodiversity we've made quite good leaps in. For example, dyslexia. We've seen such a positive change of recognizing those dyslexic traits and getting children diagnosed quicker. And lots of schools are now investing in their own in their own staff and training them up to be able to diagnose with dyslexia, and that's really positive. And lots of schools are also employing educational psychologists, etc., and that's great. I mean, it's obviously at a cost to the school, but that's brilliant to see. And yet there's, with other aspects of neurodiversity, for example, ADHD in girls, we're only really scratching the surface at the moment. And I know for working on alternative provision, we've seen a huge rise in young girls accessing alternative provision in secondary, because they've been able to mask in primary and navigate in primary. And then the transition up to secondary has been incredibly challenging. And then there's been a complete change in behaviour. And obviously, from a mainstream point of view, and to be supportive to mainstream colleagues, that's incredibly difficult to manage in huge classes with the constraints of that classroom environment. And then they end up accessing alternative provision because actually they don't understand themselves. The neurodiverse kind of
It's
behaviours manifest in different ways.
Yeah, and it's just funny you should say that about manifesting in different ways. A lot of people don't realize this with ADHD is it might come out. They might think that some I'm just saying some again, I've got to choose my words carefully. Some of these girls might become very sexually active at a very young age, and violence, and it's not violence through frustration. It's the I can never say it properly. The good hormone in your brain that releases the oh,
Dopamine.
yes, that's it. So we lack dopamine and we are seeking constantly to get that hit of dopamine. So again, a lot of people don't understand that. So they just think if it's either hyperactivity, they're not concentrating or anything like that. There is so much more to this than what people actually think. And it's not that we're being naughty or, say for me, I used to daydream, and it wasn't anything to do with that. We are seeking constantly dopamine, and a lot of people don't understand it until you actually start researching it or live through it yourself.
Do you think then that there needs to be more specific CPD and training in schools so that staff are more aware and can look out for those signs and triggers earlier?
So for again, because obviously female, sorry. For boys, I'm going to say, and men, it's so much more physical. You probably could spot a man, 99% of the time, oh God, they've got ADHD. For females, it is so different. They will look for things for perfection. They think they've got OCD. They haven't. It's because our brains are taken over that much. We'll start to do OCD things, but they haven't actually got OCD. Things like your sexuality, they could actually start taking drinking drugs at such a young age, and it's not because it's peer pressure, it's because they're seeking the dopamine to get that hit. So regarding the ADHD for females, yes, there needs to be a massive training package around it, because I don't think it's there, and a lot of people still don't understand what we do and why we do it.
Yeah, and it's only by understanding what and the why that we can not only just get the support and get the strategies right, but also create that open culture. Because I imagine, for neurodiverse colleagues, like you said, I'm thinking of staff as well as students, but for anyone really, once you understand that, once you've got that understanding, that openness, it helps you to, like you said, to find your own strategies that work, to find those self-soothing things that help regulate you, so that you can function, so that you can be, so it can be inclusive, so you can be part of everything. And I think it's
little things like people might not even think of walking down a corridor. So a lot of the time I'll lean against the wall when I'm standing, or I'm starting to sway. Now people might physically notice that on me and go, oh yeah, there's the ADHD coming out of it. But what people might not understand is, I'll never forget this day. My old boss asked me the corridors were really busy, asked me to log a pupil in because they turned up late. I went, yeah, okay, no worries. The pupil standing in front of me, couldn't remember the pupil's name. And I literally in my head saw the pupil's name travel down the corridor with my manager around the corner. And it was just, I know that sounds really bizarre to say it, but that's how I remember things. And shapes as well. And people don't understand these things about neurodiversity or things like that. I've got a colleague who really mad. She's got ADHD, but apparently it's a thing. She can taste colour. So we tell our pupils this, and they're like, "Oh, I'm like that," and it's brilliant because then we start an open conversation with the pupils, and they love it because we're all the same then, and they absolutely love it. So then we big them up and we're like, you can do anything in life, don't let anything stop you. And this is this is like not a message, but this is what I want, especially females, to understand is just because you're neurodiverse does not mean that it will stop you in life.
That's amazing. It's so true, isn't it? And I think it is through that open culture that you can get the best support in place. And I think, it's even sat here talking today, it's made me think about how often do we, so there's Neurodiversity Week that gets celebrated once a year, and we'll put reasonable adjustments in, or we'll put support for pupils in place. And I would hope that schools would do the same for staff, if staff feel comfortable sharing a diagnosis, or if they're going through a diagnosis process. But actually, do we create an open culture for all students to understand, and all staff to understand neurodiversity? So then it can not only be celebrated, but it's also allowing you to understand why things happen, why that behavior happens, why,
I think personally it's a lot better from when I was growing up, obviously, because it was still, I remember my nephew's in his 30s now, because my sister's a lot older than me, but I remember he was diagnosed with ADHD when he was a lot younger, and I remember the doctor saying to him, stop feeding him bananas, and this was in the 90s. So you think back how far we've actually come from stop feeding your kid bananas because they've got ADHD to now, we've come on leaps and bounds. But I do still think there's not enough to be done. But then obviously that's where we evolve, and we try, and we keep pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. And just try our best. That's all we can do. Keep trying our best.
What do you wish your teachers, because I'm thinking, there'll be lots of teachers and education staff listening to this, and reflecting on yourself as someone who has got ADHD, but also thinking about the kids you work with who are neurodiverse. What do you wish that your teachers had known about you?
Do you know what? Funny you should say that, because I was actually speaking to a colleague the other day and we were having the same conversation. And you, the again, choose me words properly, and I don't mean to offend anyone by saying things. The kids that play up, mess around, cause the most disruption, they're the people that get the attention. The kids that sit quietly at the back don't really cause much bother, don't get the attention because they're being good, aren't they? And looking back now, it's those ones that you have to keep an eye on, because they're the ones that'll slip through the net. But I think it's the same in society, isn't it, with everything? The ones that shout the loudest get all the attention, and the ones that just sit quietly at the back and don't do anything don't get the attention. So, and I wish looking back now, the teachers had realised that I wasn't stupid. It was just I needed to learn it in a different way and at my own pace. But unfortunately, the way the curriculum is, and I know from mainstream speaking, you've got that timetable and you've got to stick to that timetable. And again, if it doesn't get done, you've got, people coming in, Ofsted, everything like that. Well, why hasn't that been done? Why isn't this marked a certain way? Why isn't that da-da-da? And unfortunately, again, it's just not always about that. You know what I mean? We're all individuals, and I wish things were different. But
No,
do you know what? There's loads of things that I could suggest, but at the end of the day, I'm just one small person in a alternative provision with ADHD, giving advice to people. Do you know what I mean? I'm not sitting in government with a load of laws around me, so.
You're not, and you're right, and we can't change everything, but we can offer advice and support. So if you were going to offer some tips, and this is from your experience as an educator, because you work in education, but also
Yeah.
someone has ADHD, what would your top tips, what would you suggest to perhaps, say, for example, teachers who haven't got as much experience of particularly girls with ADHD or particularly neurodiverse learners as a whole? What top tips would you offer them? What would you say, right? What can they focus on to try and create a more inclusive classroom to try and support those learners?
Yeah.
So for example, one of mine would be a quiet room. Would be like
Funny you should say that. I've just literally thought, don't shout.
Okay, great.
The other thing is, don't put too much information in front of that person in one go. So even if you if you've got 2 questions that need to be done, and that person can only, start again. Say if you've got to get through a lesson, right? And that person can only physically do those 2 questions. Just let them do the 2 questions, because even doing those 2 questions might be absolutely massive to that person.
Yeah.
And the other top tips are as well is a lot of girls with ADHD have this thing about perfectionism. So they'll want to be perfect, look like immaculate to mask stuff. So especially in the alternative provision I work in, they're obsessed with, I think, like all kids though, the hair, the makeup, and they come in and they look immaculate. And I'm like, where do you get the time to do all this in the morning? But it's actually part of it's like making us feel normal, if you're allowed to use that word anymore. Do you know what I mean? And the other thing is, we have got a lot of anxiety because we want everything to be perfect, because we know it's not perfect, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And in our brains, we live in chaos constantly. So you might come into, say for me, I go to work every day, I come home, one thing could knock me off my little routine. So it's just about understanding that, one thing might have knocked that person off that morning. And you might, it's probably more about understanding, but I would like more, when you say workshops, presentations, whatever you'd like to call them, about girls with ADHD and how we present and how we function and things like that.
Yeah, I think that, well, it's invaluable, isn't it? And especially from yourself, when you have got ADHD and have been through that experience of being at school, of getting a diagnosis and how it's helped you. I do think it's really important. I think, it's always going to be hard for mainstream colleagues, as I said before.
Of course it is, yeah.
But I think if we're spotting girls or boys with traits that we think might fall under that neurodiverse umbrella, about ensuring that their key worker is checking in with them at all times, trying to track and record those behaviours, having those really in-depth meetings with parents so that you can share information, share strategies, share things that work and don't work, but then also gather that information and then getting that EHCP and are in place ASAP. And if parents and carers and pupil or student are wishing, get that pathway started, so that then if there is a diagnosis there, it then opens up that language of, okay, well, this is what I present with, here's my diagnosis, now let's learn what that means, how I can manage it, what strategies I can put in place so I can be successful. And whether that's in mainstream or alternative provision, I think that's really important, because sometimes, and I see it in mainstream colleagues, and I'm aware, I've done shows on behaviour. I know how challenging behaviour can impact staff and can impact a mainstream classroom. It can impact an alternative provision classroom, but it's about
Definitely.
sometimes recognising that behaviour, it isn't always the defiance that you think it is. It can be, particularly now as we move forward with recognising things like pathological demand avoidance, which falls under the autism umbrella, about recognising that sometimes what we might see as defiant or challenging behaviour is actually a behaviour that is directly because of actually what's going on underneath the surface, which is high levels of anxiety, which may be neurodiversity. So it's about, and that has to come from CPD as well, doesn't it? Because we have to be able to recognise that. So for me,
Well, yeah, because it's even like down to things like lights. Do you know what I mean? It might just be that the lights in a certain classroom are too bright.
or a triggering, yeah.
Or the seating plan, or it could be that little tiny things, like the perfume or the aftershave that the teacher's wearing just sets them off. So I think it's teeny tiny little things like this that can set people off, and they don't realise it.
So I guess it's about having that consideration and using, if you can, CPD, etc., to learn more about that, because that's not something I would have ever considered. Sally was around smells, but actually,
Massive. It's funny because we're massive, and so the teacher that I work with, we're very aware of things, smells, light. Sometimes the kids in our classes, most of the time, they sit there and they're like, "Can we have the lights off?" And we go, "Yeah," and we pull the blinds up, and it's because they don't like the lights on. Smells.
Because I guess if that smell puts you on high alert as a learner, then you're already in a state of anxiety and fight or flight before the learning even starts, which means you're not regulated enough to process the information.
No, it's little things like, I know this again, my son, most kids, I know it's like, again, tiny little thing. Most kids, when they get a bit of dog dirt on the shoe, don't they? They go to the nearest puddle, wipe it off, and crack on going to school. He phoned me and went, "I've got to go home." And I was like, "Yeah, go home, wash it, and get back to school." I phoned the school. The school might think I'm mad for doing that, but I know he will have to go home. He will have to clean his shoe to an inch of its life, because he can't bear the smell of it, because he'll balk, and then he can go back to school. So for me, I'm just like, do you know what? He's gone home. He's done what he needs to do. He's gone back to school. That's enough for me. But some teachers might be like, "Well, no, he needs to get into school," but they don't realise little things like this. So they
And
don't
actually,
realise. Yeah, they don't realise, again, and I'm not saying it's all teachers, and I know everyone has a job to do, but they might not realise that they've had a route for the parents just to get that child to school in the morning is massive.
yeah.
So, for me, the fact that my child goes to school near enough every single day, unless he's sick, then I'm made up with him. And then he's staying to school, he's doing his lessons now and again, he has a wobble. I am chuffed to bits, and I will keep pushing and pushing and pushing him. So I think it's just about having that understanding of things.
And I guess the understanding that certain experiences that have happened before school or may happen during school may to us seem insignificant, but to a neurodiverse learner or even a neurodiverse staff member might have implications that mean that come the next lesson, come later on the day when they've processed it, you'll see behaviours that are unexplainable, that you're not quite sure why it's happened, but actually are a direct result of something that's happened earlier.
Do you know what? Yeah, it's
together.
silly little things like this. So take, for instance, this is coming from an adult point of view here. We've got no driveways where I live. So just say we're dead good, and we've all, you morally, you'd park outside your own house and everything like that. Well, a good few times I couldn't park outside my house. Doesn't usually bother me because I'm like, do you know what? We all pay our tax, whatever. Someone else will park there, fine. Something has happened that day and it had knocked me a little bit because my routine was a little bit off. I come home that night and I sobbed because I couldn't park outside my own house. And it was coming up to Christmas, which I'm not particularly great around Christmas anyway, because it's all changed, different
Mhm.
smells, all the flashing lights are on, everyone's, different routine in school. And I cried because I couldn't park outside my own house. So luckily enough, my family know me and they're fine. But if I'd just told somebody else that, they'd be like, what are you crying for? Because you can't park outside your own house. But it wasn't just that, it was a combination of things. So it's just having that little bit of, waiting to go, actually, there might be something tiny that's happened, but it's a knock on effect from something else.
So what advice would you give to neurodiverse staff then? Staff that are maybe in the process of getting diagnosed or that have a diagnosis. What would you say to what top tips would you have for them? Would you say that, really communication and going and seeing your line manager and your senior leadership team is
You know
key?
what? It depends if you've got that relationship with them. Where I work, everyone's, well, I presume everyone is. My head teacher's door's always open. I know I can go and speak to her whenever I want. I know I've got staff members there that I can speak to whenever I want. There's no one there to judge, so it's a really open door policy in school. But I understand that some people haven't. Do you know what I'd do is just find the teacher that, or your colleague that you can talk to, and just talk to them and use them.
And recognizing that actually sometimes burnout will happen. I mean, teacher workload is horrendous anyway, and I don't think there's any listener that would argue otherwise. But I think sometimes recognizing that burnout is because your brain is also processing so much from the day that actually sometimes rest and asking if you can, because it is difficult and it's everyone's personal journey, but asking for reasonable adjustments if you think you need them, like that little bit extra processing time, like that extension on a deadline if you can, because
Yeah.
burnout's a real thing for teachers as it is, but never mind when you've got neurodiverse needs and you're processing so much more about the world around
You
you.
Especially people with ADHD will want to, they won't really say no, and they take on everything because they don't want to say no. So you have to learn to say no, which is what I've had to learn to do in these past couple of years. So um, I've texted my mum on a few occasions and gone, I can't come down today. I need to stay in. And she knows, all right, love, don't worry about it. And she texts us back and goes, don't worry, pet. Love you lots. I'll see you soon. I'm there the next day. But it's just because for that day, I need to stay in because I just can't physically and mentally just go out and communicate with the world.
So
So,
sometimes giving yourself breaks, then giving yourself
yeah,
from a school point of view, maybe asking for somewhere quiet, like a quiet room for your PPA, advanced notice of changes or
yeah,
requests, time to process. They're practical strategies that not only could be asked for, but actually from a leadership point of view, if you know you've got neurodiverse colleagues and staff, maybe it's about having that conversation and doing it in a private and supportive
I
way,
do,
but
I
about
do think sorry, I do think what you said before, having that key worker. So if you've got a person in school that you can go to and talk about things and for that person to understand,
yeah.
and it's confidential, even if it's just to have a little moan for 5 minutes, but having that bit of time, and then, or even if you are struggling a little bit with something, you can go to that person and you can talk it through, because you might get, that person might have a different way of doing it. You might go, oh God, yeah, if I just do that and that, then that'll help.
Yeah,
And I think regular check-ins, and I don't mean just bobbing your head through the door, is everyone okay? I mean literally having that check-in. But again, I know myself, it is so difficult to get that time because we
yeah,
literally don't have any time to do anything anymore.
yeah. It is. I mean, I think our workload for all education staff is just massive. But actually, we need to make time because as statistics show, we've got. There's been there was a really interesting study that said in the last 3 years there's been a 400% rise in women over the age of 18 seeking a diagnosis for neurodiversity,
My
obviously
God.
ADHD. So we are seeing a rise in adults recognizing um, behaviors within themselves, triggers, etc. And so actually, as busy as we are, for good practice and just to support each other, we need to make that time. And if we create that open dialogue, and we do it in a sensitive way, then I think that helps our colleagues as well, doesn't it? Because, you
Do you
know,
know what I think I'm one of the lucky ones. I mean, I know it always pipes back to where, because at the end of the day, we spend more time at work than we do at home. That's just the way it is. I think I'm one of the lucky ones about where I work, and my family, because my family absolutely completely understand me, because obviously we do have ADHD and autism that run in our family, so we are a very understanding family in that sense, and my friends are as well. But then I think to myself, sometimes I've chose my friends because they are understanding of me. So, it's one of those things. But I do know there's people out there that feel alone, or they feel, and I always come back to saying you feel stupid, but I think we do. Neurodiverse people sometimes feel like we are, because we don't fit in, or we don't get understood, or we have to learn in a different way. But we're not. We're not stupid. It's just our brains work a little bit differently, and we just, take that little bit time to come around. But I think with support and finding the right people to talk to and having that understanding, we fly. We absolutely fly.
I love that. And I think as well, like you said, it's about creating that open culture where people can feel like they can talk about things. And I think, we need to get better at creating that open culture across schools as a general around neurodiversity, so that if people are recognizing traits or within themselves, that then, like you said, there are lots of adults that don't know about how to get support, about making sure that schools were signposting colleagues to agencies, charities, etc., that can offer that support as well, because really reaching out and talking about it is the only way you get the support that you not only need, but that you rightly deserve, because actually we should be inclusive of everyone, shouldn't we?
Do you know what though? It varies right down to the doctors as well. And again, I think it depends on what your doctor says. Do you know what I mean? Like I can be very strong-minded when I want to be. And for me, when I got diagnosed, I'd had 10 years of back and forth to the doctors all the time, and in the end I'd had enough.
Yeah.
So I was very strong-minded in that sense. But if you've got someone that's doubting themselves a little bit, again, it's everything. It's so difficult to get that diagnosis, because your doctor might go, "Oh, actually, no, you're not," but you are. So it's so complicated, the system, and it is, and I feel for people.
Yeah, no, I do too. And I think that's great advice, to be persistent. And also, if you need to, reach out to those agencies and charities and support networks, because actually, if you're feeling low or alone and you're feeling like you can't get the support, they're there to help you to continue to be persistent, so that you get the diagnosis that you want and that you need, so that then it opens up that opportunity to get support, to identify triggers, to learn more about how your brain works and what you need to to best navigate the world around you. Sally, you've been absolutely incredible. Please, I hope you'll stay on and listen, because I'm sure
Yeah.
I'll come back to you with lots of questions very soon and very shortly. But thank you, Sally, to hear from you directly, as somebody who has ADHD, as a woman, as an adult. I think you've offered some great tips today for children, for teachers, and for adults and colleagues. So thank you so much, Sally.
You're very welcome.
That was Sally Gordon, who obviously is a teaching assistant with over 10 years experience, who does so much work around ADHD, particularly in girls. It's been absolutely fantastic to have her on today. So thank you, Sally. Before I introduce my next guest, I'd just like to say that this show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishing professional development books and resources to support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Have you checked out their latest releases? Use code JCTTR2324 for 20% off your order. Don't miss out. Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading. Wow, guys, honestly, I think this has given me so much food for thought as a colleague, as a teacher, but also as leadership, of how we best support colleagues. But how do we support our families, and how do we advocate for them when we're so busy as teachers and educators? Well, hopefully my next guest will be able to support us with a little bit with that. Jo Gale-Braith is the founder of a charitable organisation in Liverpool that supports neurodiverse children and families. And hopefully we can get that perspective now from that more parent and carer and family point of view. Jo, hopefully you're there. I know that you're down under your Autism in Motion Twitter. Hopefully if you just request to speak, which is if you press the mic button, then hopefully you'll be added on. It'd be great to
We've
hear
invited her in, but I think because she's on her laptop, she might struggle to call in compared to if she's on a phone.
Jo, well, hopefully you will be able to join us. Let us know. Do request to speak using that mic if you're on your phone, or if you can move over to a smartphone, that would be brilliant. One of the things I was going to talk to Jo about was how do we best support our families who are perhaps struggling with behaviours at home, who are seeking that support or that diagnosis. I've had quite a lot of experience of this within my time as an educator myself. I've had families who potentially are at their wits' end because of the real length in waiting for a diagnosis or for an EHCP. Hi everyone, apologies for the little technical error there. Hopefully Jo will be able to join us again in a second. It's always a little bit of a nightmare. Sometimes technical things happen, but hopefully she'll be able to join us again in a second. Obviously we'll be speaking to Jo about her experiences of supporting neurodiverse families, parents and carers, and children as well. I know from my own experience, as I mentioned before, often parents and carers can be at their wits' end, really worrying about how to get a diagnosis, how long it's going to take, frustrated at the length of time, particularly pathway can take at the moment, and then even getting an EHCP. And then finding the right provision and the right support, whether that is remaining in a mainstream and supporting, within a mainstream, whether that's a one-to-one or additional support, or whether that's finding the right alternative provision. It can be an incredibly difficult task and an incredibly difficult experience for parents and carers for their child to get a diagnosis and then to get that right provision in place and that right support. And that's no disrespect to mainstream colleagues at all, because many young people, children and young people who are diagnosed with neurodiversity, whether that be ADHD, ASC, whether it be dyslexia, dyscalculia, etc., are really happy with the support and the additional support that can be put in place in a mainstream with that diagnosis and with that EHCP. But it can be really difficult, and it can be so difficult for parents because for some they may only have one child that demonstrates neurodiverse behaviours or triggers. And so quite often from my experience, I've had parents who said, well, what do I do now? What do we do? Because they've had no experience. And this is where people like Jo really come into the forefront and really do support. Jo, I'm hoping that you're there again now. I apologise for the technical error.
Yeah, sorry. No, I don't know what happened. Was it me?
No, not your fault at all. I do apologise. So Jo, you were just saying that you hadn't got any real experience of from an educational point of view from working in schools, but what's your experience? Why are you passionate about neurodiversity? Okay. What's your personal experience?
So my quickest way of doing it is I'll just dead quickly tell you the story of why we came about. Okay, so I had Daniel. Daniel was my third child, and he was such a good boy, very quirky, but I didn't really notice that so much when he was little. I just saw that he was just my baby, he was my youngest. And then when he got to school, he'd been getting told off and stuff, and I was like, why is he getting told off? He's such a good boy, he hates the thought of being shouted at or, being naughty. And these things that he was getting told off for. I mean, he got sent outside the headmistress's class office, for messing around. And I was like, wow, this is not him. And then his teacher at the time was the Senko. I think he got to year 1 and she was the Senko, and she called us in for parents' day. You know, we'd been having issues on the playground with the other children, and you know, saying he had no friends and stuff like this. And I'd been asking, and I'd been saying, oh, you know, you know, is he okay? And all this sort of stuff. And, you know, is there anything that we can do at home? And then it got to like nearly the end of the year, which was quite frustrating at the time. And she said, oh, I think he's got ADHD. Can you still hear me? Yeah, just
absolutely.
So then I went off, and my husband was like, no, he hasn't got ADHD, because in his mind he was like, you know, what you think of as ADHD, you know, Dan's 17 now, so this is going back a few years ago, and we weren't very educated about these conditions. So we were just like, you know, he's really clever. He is really clever. And we don't know how he knows the stuff that he knows. And we were thinking, oh, it's just because he's so clever. He's bored in the classroom. The teacher, you know, she doesn't know how to cope with him or whatever. This was what we were saying. And no, he hasn't got ADHD because he doesn't fit the picture of ADHD in our minds. Anyway, we goes off to our GP. The GP said no, but it got my mind working. And I started looking into it more, and he was doing things like he thought he was a cat. He used to crawl around meowing. He used to call himself the kitten, and it just ticked all the boxes for what at the time was called Asperger's, which is not called that anymore. It's not diagnosed as Asperger's anymore. So I then went to the Senko, who at the time was still Dan's teacher, and I said, look, I do think there's something going on. I'm not 100% sure on whether it's ADHD, but I think it could possibly be Asperger's, and she agreed with me. And off he goes on the pathway. So like 2.5 years later, this is how long it's taken. You know, this kid's still crawling around in the classroom. The school was meeting his needs, I would say, somewhat. They were doing amazing stuff for him, and there was lots of support getting put in place, but he was still struggling, and he was still really, really anxious, and things like his sensory needs. So he used to play up a little bit in school, and the teachers couldn't understand why, and I couldn't understand why either. And it was things like the carpets in the classroom, but I didn't know about this. Sorry, I'm skipping ahead of myself a little bit. Sorry. No, so as a mum, I started to research better than the FBI, aren't we, when we get going, and started learning more about all the different things, the different challenges that the kids might face, or adults as well, might face, such as like sensory processing difficulties and stuff like that. So I've gone on a course here in Liverpool with an organisation who are sadly no longer running, called the Isabella Trust, and they brought in a lady called Lisa from Shine Therapy. I don't know if you've heard of them. And I did a course around sensory processing for Dan, and realised quickly that the issues that he was having in the classroom were sensory. Now, without me doing that course, I wouldn't have known that, and then I wouldn't have been able to go in and speak to the teachers about it. And I carried on learning, going on basically every course available. But without that knowledge, I don't think that I'd have been able to help him, and I don't think I'd have been able to help the teachers help him. And I think he was in a mainstream at the time, and he carried on during in mainstream. But I don't think he'd have stayed without.
So really, well, that's what, you know, without your support and without that kind of real understanding and knowledge, I mean, obviously absolutely incredible as you as a mum and as a family to take, you know, to really kind of embrace that and educate yourselves and try different things, and you know, and create all those strategies that, you know, have obviously over time really worked and allowed him to successfully learn. I mean, from a parent point of view, although we are, and we've talked quite a lot with Sally about creating an open culture and about celebrating our diversity, but do you think there is still for quite a lot of parents a bit of a stigma when they're waiting for their child to be diagnosed, and a worry and a concern about what life will be like if they get diagnosed and what that'll mean for their child?
Yeah, I do. But I also think because it's an invisible condition, you can't see it. Often parents, well, I certainly did, think that it's something that they're doing wrong. You get me?
Yeah.
And then so you go to the doctor, or quite often it's the parent picking up on things in our experience. Sorry, so
Yeah.
so going back just a little bit previously to the question, because I've got ADHD as well, so you can understand, and I'm not medicated. You can understand now why the conversation is the way it is.
It's absolutely fine.
So the reason Autism Motion was started was that along the way, I sort of met other parents and made friends with like-minded people. And we found that a lot of the language used is quite negative, very focused on the difficulties. And what we wanted to learn more about was, okay, our children do have difficulties, there are challenges, but what we want to do is we want to embrace all the great things about it. We want to focus on what the interests are and work on the difficulties around in a positive way. Does this make sense now? In a positive way. So
No,
we acknowledge that there are challenges, but there are also a lot of positives, and there wasn't anything out there at the time to help us to overcome social difficulties, to help them build friendships. So that's why Autism in Motion was started.
So would you recommend to any parent to reach out to any? Obviously, there's different. We've got listeners up and down the country. We've got across the globe, to be honest. So for parents who maybe suspect that their child's got a neurodiversity, or are in the process of waiting for a diagnosis, or have got a diagnosis, would you say that reaching out to organisations, charities, agencies, help groups is a good thing because it allows you to get that support?
Yeah, I would say so. I would say so, but along the way, I did come across quite. This is going to sound terrible now, but people can be quite competitive. Like, my child's got more difficulties than yours, a little bit.
So that can present a barrier, can't it, for parents?
Yeah.
And I know for myself, parents that I've worked with closely, the whole thing can be a minefield, and it's so it can bring up a lot of anxiety and trauma for parents and carers as well, can't it?
Sorry, Anna, what was the next question that you asked? You asked 2 questions.
So I just wanted to. Well, I was gonna ask you, moving on beautifully. Actually, I was gonna ask you, what do you think schools can do to better support neurodiverse learners?
Okay, so on the note of what I've just said, what we find often, I think we find as well, is when you go into the schools and you're saying, as a parent, my little Johnny, he's got these difficulties, what can you do to help him? He needs an educational psychologist, he needs an EHCP, if that's relevant. Obviously, it's not always relevant. Then often they'll go, well, in my experience, your little Johnny, but Billy's well worse. So I think about acknowledging individual children, and the individual challenges and the individual needs, because often, just because you've had a bit of training in autism or ADHD, it doesn't mean that you know everything about it, and you also don't know about how it presents individually, because me and Sally, we've both got ADHD, but we're both very different people, and the way it affects Sally and the way it affects me can also be very different, and that goes across the board with our children. So I think learning about the child specifically, and the only way they're going to do that is to speak to the parents.
Of course. And that's one of the big top tips I sort of gave at the beginning, was that I think, as hard as it is, because teachers are busy and they've got really busy workloads, but parental and carer support, and having their meetings, and figuring out what triggers and strategies work and can be mimicked at home and school, and what's successful, and saying to parents and carers, what works for you, what helps, or what doesn't work. It's like a big jigsaw puzzle, isn't it? It needs to be put together. I think it really needs to be like a 360 approach for each child, and as hard as that is to do, it really is the best way to support each individual learner, isn't it?
And I mean, Daniel's got a younger sister, Scarlett. She's my daughter as well. We'll go around the wheel to introduce her into it. But so she's very different to Dan. She had global developmental delay, and so was delayed in all areas. And when we got, so she's in a mainstream as well, but when we got to school, she presents in school, she's like a Stepford child in school. When you were saying before about being perfect, that's it.
Yeah.
But at home, her behaviour is very different. And school initially, so she was in the first school that she was in, they didn't recognise, they didn't see her difficulties, and then unfortunately, because we lived outside the area, she didn't get a place then in the year one, in reception. We had to move to a different school, and it just happened that the TA in the reception class was one of the nans of the children who came to our activities. So we knew her already, and she knew Scarlett, and then the way she was in school and the way she was at home, she knew, she could see the bigger picture, if you like. And so because of that, and only I think because of that, it meant that Scarlett got the support that she actually needed in school, rather than them just going on what they saw with their own eyes, if you get.
See, again, it's so hard because, and Sally said it, I've said it, but because girls present so differently and often mask, when they get home, like you said, there can be lots of different behaviours. They can be exhausted because they've had to mask all day. And so then and I say this as having been a mainstream teacher, there's a tendency then to think, well, it's not that it's a you problem, but that you go, well, we're not seeing that in school, so it's parenting. But it's not always. It's just that they've managed so well at school to mask everything that at some point the mask has to come off, and the safe place to take the mask off and to regulate is at home. And so that, I think, it's really key, like you said, that schools and parents and carers work so closely together because it's got to be that joined up approach, hasn't it?
Does, yeah. And there's something called the Coke bottle effect. It's like a little poem. I don't know if you've read it.
Yeah, I know which one you mean.
I think
absolutely.
everybody should read it.
Yeah.
I think everybody should read it. But yeah, from our experience, often parents feel like they've got something to prove. That people don't believe that their child has these difficulties, and the first sort of thing, if you go to CAMS, is they put you on a parent course, and they see, I think that needs to be renamed, from being just like a parent course, because that sounds like they think you don't know how to parent, and it's not. It's more about education, isn't it?
Of course, absolutely, of course. And speaking of education, do you think the curriculum and the education as and education as it stands, do you think it does support neurodiverse learners, or do you think we do, as many of us teachers have said, it needs a reform, because there's so much in the curriculum for them to learn, there's so much to get through in terms of the education system. What are your thoughts on that?
It's hard, isn't it? It really is hard. So you've got such a wide range of children with needs and abilities right across the spectrum. Yeah, so you've got children with learning disabilities who are autistic, and you've got children and are quite obviously affected, and then you've got children who are very, very subtle and will mask in school. And as a teacher, you're expected to be able to cater really to such a wide range of needs, and not so much the learning disability side as much, obviously, in a mainstream setting. But let's look at a mainstream classroom. You might have a girl in the mainstream classroom who's masking, who's anxious, who's a perfectionist, who you don't see slip at all. She sits at the back of the class and she keeps her head down and hardly speaks to anybody. And then you might have an ADHD girl, I'm saying girl just to be off a little bit, but bouncing off the walls, mouthy and struggling to engage. And you're supposed to be able to deal with that and everything in between in one classroom environment. And my son's very academic and always has been. And was because he was academic, he didn't get a place in it. Well, he tried to, first of all, he tried to say that he didn't need an education, health and care plan. So I had to fight for that to get him the support that he needed in school. And then there was a lot, because he's got like a spiky profile, so he's high in some areas and lower in others, like his understanding and stuff. And so he needed a one-to-one really, but the school had to do the graduated approach and prove that they were doing everything they could, and the local authority to get the funding, and then the funding obviously isn't very much, as we know, that the local authority give. And then so Dan didn't really get a one-to-one, and I wonder sometimes if he had got a one-to-one, what would have happened with his results? Would he have got better results? Would he have to be now doing a level 2 in college, or would he be sat in sixth form doing his A-levels, which was the plan? And I think if he'd have been in he's mainstream academically, but he's not really, and he struggled so much socially and with the sensory environment as well of the classroom. And if he'd have been in a smaller classroom with less pupils, as it is in a SEND setting, how would he have gone on then? And that makes me wonder. And you see, here in Liverpool, there's specialist provision for children with learning difficulties or emotional and social behavioural type schools, and there's mainstream schools. And there's nothing really for those in-betweeners, and there's lots of in-betweeners, whether they've got ADHD or they've got ASD. And we didn't really see this, did we, when we were in school? Do you get me? We didn't really see it. But I suppose if you look back and you think, there probably was kids in your class with autism or ADHD, but the more significant ones would have gone to a special school.
Yeah, that's such a good point, isn't it?
Haven't they?
Yeah, they have. You're right, and you know, things have changed, and we've developed some awareness. But you're right. There's still, as you to use your quote there, in betweeners of where do they go, and how best do we support those vulnerable young people as well. So, what would your hope for education in the future be?
I quite like these resource bases that they used to have years ago. They had them when Dan was in primary. They had resource bases, and they've started to come back now. So it would be a smaller, more specialised provision with trained staff who know what they're doing and the subtleties. You were talking before, and you were saying about in your class, because you're in. Did you say you were in SEN? Are you in a SEN provision?
Yeah, so I'm alternative provision. So we have small classes.
Yeah, so you get to know the children, and you get to know the needs, and you can tell. But also, I suppose, like I do when I walk into my house or we go somewhere, you're scanning for any potential triggers or any potential possible triggers throughout the day. Yeah. So you know that if you do this, little Johnny might be triggered by that. So you'll sort of be on guard for that. But in a mainstream school, they can't really do that, can they? Because there's 30 kids in a classroom.
Exactly.
But if there were smaller classes within like a more specialised setting, I think that'd be perfect.
I think that's such a good point, and one that, you know, I know educators up and down the country are screaming for as well, and saying, you know, we do need smaller classes, and we need a curriculum that's not as overcrowded, so that we can have a little bit of flexibility to support learners who need that.
Rather than the diagnosis, it's not always about a diagnosis, is it?
No, sometimes it's just like meeting the need and getting that support in place, whether you're an adult or a child. I mean, Jo, I'll be honest with you, I could sit and talk to you all day. You've been such an amazing guest, and it's lovely to hear from a parental point of view. I mean, we've run out of time, unfortunately, but I'd love to have you on as a guest in the future and deep dive a little bit more into a parent and carer point of view. But to everybody listening today, I hope you've been able to take away something from today. Massive thanks to Jo, and understanding from a parent and carer point of view how where the challenges are, and about, you know, the anxieties that families might face, and some of the stigmas, and how we best support our families. Also, how we best support our children and young people when they may be masking, or, you know, not showing typical behaviours that we would expect, to not just write that off as behaviour and challenge and defiance, but actually that it might be a need for something underlying need there. And also for our staff, I hope that any staff that are maybe seeking a diagnosis or need that more support or have just been diagnosed, I hope that you find that key person to reach out to. But regardless of whether you're a student, a staff member or a parent and carer, creating this open dialogue, this not just inclusivity and celebratory approach, but also just a general widespread approach of knowledge, of understanding, is really, really important as we move forward. And let's hope that we continue to progress, that we continue to take strides to make all our classrooms, however they look, more inclusive, more accepting and more celebratory of every individual learner's need. Thank you so much to everybody for listening today. I hope that you can take something away from today's show. I know I, as a leader, as an educator, certainly will. Thank you for taking the time to listen today, and I'll speak to you very soon. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.